So the chess drama just keeps on coming right now, and today we saw something happen that we haven't seen in the chess world for 8 years, and it's got people wondering, is world champion Magnus Carlsen on tilt right now? So he had the white pieces today. He was playing against Nodirbek Abdusattorov, a very young, dangerous opponent from Uzbekistan. And these two guys have got history because Nodirbek actually beat Magnus about a year and a half ago in the 2021 World Rapid Championship. And that pipped Magnus to the title. Now today they met in a classical game of chess. This was played in the Netherlands in the prestigious Tata Steel Masters tournament, and Magnus was looking to bounce back from a defeat he had yesterday against Anish Giri. So he kicked off here with pawn c4. Now c5 was played by Abdusattorov, so this is the English attack. Abdusattorov is copying. We see the knight developing here, black does the same, yet more copying on the next two moves. And now I've drawn a couple arrows here to indicate common moves played by white in this position here, but Magnus instead goes for this e3 move today, and he looks to set up the d4 break, and that's why we see e5 clamping on that square. Now you can still go d4 there, but instead Magnus goes for something slightly quieter, less explosive in the centre. And now if black kicks on with e4, looks really logical to take that space. It's not actually a good move because the knight hops here and you're attacking the pawn twice and you can't actually defend it adequately, because if you go d5 we chop like this and it's soon dropping, and if you go with the queen like this, well, there's different good moves, but this is a really simple one to add more pressure, pick up the pawn. So the pawn doesn't kick on. Instead we see d5 breaking in the centre. Magnus now captures, we see the knight recapture, he castles his king, and bishop e7 from black prepares to do the same, get the king to safety. And now Magnus takes this moment to improve the bishop, move it to b5. And it begs the question, why would you do it in two goes? But earlier when Magnus developed, there was a pawn on c4, it was blocking the way. So now he improves it, he pins this knight, and so he puts pressure on this pawn. Now there's different ways to protect that pawn, and it's quite instructive really, because if you go say bishop f6, looks logical, but then you're running into knight e4, it's a bit uncomfortable, you don't want to give up that bishop. If you go f6, well now you're weakening your king. d4 is a good counter break here, and so instead we see Nodirbek defend with his queen. He puts it on c7, but if he does it immediately, he'll leave this knight which Magnus can capture. So that's why we first see the capture here, pawn takes back, and then the queen comes to c7. And it's multi-purpose of course, because it also adds a bit of protection on the c6 knight. So Magnus now strikes out in the centre, we see pawn captures here, and a mass liquidation, the knight coming in, and after bishop d7 to deal with some of this pressure, we can see out of the first 12 moves, Magnus is doing quite well. He's a bit ahead in development, his king's the first one to castle, but now he just breaks opening principles in a really strange way. So you want to get your pieces developed. That's what the opening principles say. We've got a bishop still on the back rank, also a queen, the rooks need connecting, and so the top two computer moves are either going bishop b2 or queen c2. But what Magnus does here is knight back to f3, a strange looking move because the knight literally just hit that square. So you're underdeveloping it, and you're stepping off this diagonal, allowing the bishop to come here with tempo, which is what Nodirbek now does, but this is Magnus's idea, and it's a very, very risky idea. He goes bishop to a3, giving an exchange in the corner, which is snapped off by Nodirbek. Now, what's Magnus's idea? Well, his bishop is now slicing, the king can't castle, we can see the power of this queen as well, the rook's coming very quickly, the knight can hop back, so it is a big initiative for white. But a rook is a rook, you know, this is dangerous. Now there's only one move here for black to actually keep an advantage, because black now has a small advantage, about half a pawn. So can you guess what that move is to stay ahead? So the way to play is castles queenside. You maybe guessed that one. Connects your rooks, gets that king to relative safety. Now I say relative because Magnus now goes rook c1 and there's no pawn cover here in front of the king, and neither player is grabbing the pawn or even defending the pawn. Nodirbek now goes king to b8 because they're both way more focused on development, king safety. But here, without seeing a good kind of improving move of another one of these pieces, Magnus does snap the pawn. Now, it's not the kind of thing you'd usually want to do, because now you open lines towards your king, and sure enough, Nodirbek pounces and activates the rook. But at the same time, Magnus does need to try and pick up some material for being an exchange down and keep some kind of initiative. Now, where does your queen go here? If you get greedy and take this pawn, can you see a really nice tactic for black here to just end the game on the spot? So the move to play is rook takes on g2 check, because after king recaptures, there's this discovered check and you pick up the queen on f7. This is just curtains. So coming back here, that one's no good. Now you can take on h7. This is actually one of the computer's top moves when you run it. At first it says white is doing well, then it kind of catches up, says no, better for black. But humanly, intuitively, it just looks horrible to not only open the g file, but also the h file against your own king. So Magnus didn't do that one, and even if he did, it's not clear it would have been such a great move. So he drops back the queen to this b file, which creates some pressure down here, some potential tactics. And now bishop g4 is a great move by Abdusattorov. You open up this rook, of course, and you also create a threat to actually win this minor piece, because the pawn is pinned to the king. Now, how do you actually defend against that threat? You don't want to sidestep with the king, or then black simply shatters the pawn structure, and that's awful. So how else do you do something here? Well, what would you play here? Because there's a really natural, obvious move, but it's actually awful, which we're about to see. So how many of us would go knight to d4? I mean, you centralize the knight. This knight can't take, or you drop the queen, right? You're threatening to take here. Can't get my words out. There's also this pin down the b file. But here's the really nice tactic for black. You can actually take on d4 and sacrifice the queen. Now, the best move for white is to recapture the knight here. But if you take, and you're quite a bit worse, but if you take the queen, now you've just walked into mate in 4. So it starts with this brilliant knight move of knight f3 check. Now the pawn has to recapture, because if you try and sidestep with the king, well then the rook slams down, and this is leading to mate, king e2, and then a really nice finish of either knight g1 mate, or you can go knight d4 mate, because you've got this discovered check, double check, 2 pieces. So you can't actually sidestep with the king. If you take with this one, well then we recapture with check from this rook, and again this rook just shuts the trap. That's mate. So a very, very nice variation. That's why knight d4 is no good, and that's why Magnus now moved the knight. You can also go bishop e2. It's one of the computer's top moves, but the knight hops back, and now this is such a star move from Abdusattorov, because when you look at his pieces, it's not easy to improve them. The knight can't move because of the pin. The queen can't really activate because it's holding onto the c6 square. This one's already pretty active, so is the rook. But what about this one? How can you do something? And that's where we see rook d1 played. Now this is so good because it exchanges off this very active and powerful rook. You can't move it away anywhere, or you drop your knight. So Magnus captures, the bishop recaptures, and suddenly some of this queenside pressure is alleviated. So bishop f1 now played by Magnus. Looks strange to kind of tuck that back defensively, but it would seem that his idea is to maybe go knight d3 to f4, something like that, but not leave the protection of the king here and allow this bishop f3 stuff. But now knight e5 shuts down any kind of knight d3 ideas. h3 now played, and this is an important idea as well, because black was threatening knight g4, looking to checkmate down here. So that one stops that idea. Bishop f3 now played, using once again the pin, and again you cannot capture because then we check, and not only that, we're getting mated in the corner. No good. So instead we see Magnus centralize his queen, queen to d4. Computer doesn't like that one, by the way. It wanted to start shuffling with queen to b1 here. Sorry, I still realised I'm on the analysis board. Back to the moves board. But instead we had queen d4. Now we see the rook coming over to the d file, kicking the queen. It comes over here, hits this pawn, and now the bishop just calmly drops back, gives the pawn, because after captures we see another great policy from Abdusattorov, which is just exchanging pieces, because when you're ahead on material you want to initiate trades. So the bishops are coming off the board. Magnus first goes bishop to b2, pressuring this knight. We see captures on f1, king recaptures, the queen checked, the king went away, and now the knight being attacked, it just calmly retreated, saved itself, and the queen is still holding this pawn. Now black's threatening to win this pawn on a2, but if you retreat with the queen, well, it gets really passive. Black can start invading with their queen and their rook, everything like that, not what you want. So knight f3 activates the knight, stops rook d2. Now we see the queen capturing this pawn. The bishop comes to f6, hits that rook, there was a check, king h2, and now pawn a5, excellent move, past pawns are made to be pushed, as they say. Knight d4, Magnus has to go for some counterplay, and you do not want to be capturing that one because you're helping white improve the pieces. This is a sample line, and suddenly you're getting loads of play with white. The king's exposed, that's a monster bishop, and this pawn could be running supported by the bishop. So instead, queen d5 centralizes that queen, covers the knight, and also threatens to check as I'm drawing and pick up this bishop on f6. But does Magnus do anything about that? Well, not directly. Instead, he counterattacks on the rook on d1. But more brilliancy from Abdusattorov. So he checks. We see the pawn block. And this is where he just calmly steers the game towards a better endgame. Because there's some big threats here. You know, if you move your rook away, say e1, you attack this pawn. Well, then you can chop with check. Queen recaptures, you don't want to run into this pin against the king, and then there are different good moves for white, but here's a sample line. You can even swap the queens here. Queen f5 check was another move, and then start running this pawn. And with the bishop covering everything, supporting the pawn, another pawn and king could be coming. This is very dangerous, better for white in fact. But Abdusattorov instead plays rook takes on d4, star move. Because now he's taking it into this endgame, liquidating. Now you don't take here first. First check, pawn blocks, then pick it up, and now you've got the 3 on 2, but as we're going to see, this is devilishly tricky to try and hold for the white player. So Magnus runs his pawn, black does the same. Queen a2 comes in front, also hits this pawn on f7, so it comes down to f5, and now h5 from Magnus, the queen drops back, and we see this exchange of pawns. Takes with check, king goes, queen to f3 hits this g pawn, so the king covers, check, king goes, queen to e5, and this was the thumbnail picture I drew. Look at that absolute monster queen just dominating the board, and we'll see the power of that soon. So the king covers the pawn once again, and now b5 gets this one going up the board. Queen b4 steps in front, king b7, g4 gets this one going. We see a pair liquidated, but king b6. It's just a relentless march of king and pawn here. Now we see the queen step away. There was an obvious check, by the way, but the thing is you just drive the king up the board, and no matter what you do, you just can't stop this relentless march. So instead Magnus comes here, and after b4 we see the idea. He's blocking that square, trying to stop the advance, but the king carries on. So first we see the white king shuffling as the black king comes in. Now some checks, king g2, and here comes the pawn. This is why the queen started checking, supporting b3. Magnus starts checking, but the king comes in. You just can't stop its relentless drive down the board. Queen h8 again covers the square, but now king c2 threatens to advance the pawn. We had check, king d1, queen h8 comes back, again covers the square, but now queen d2 check, king g3, b2, and the game was finished here. Magnus resigned. As you can see, the pawn is marching on, and to give some sample line, I mean, say you check here, where you can block with a counter check, and then the queens are coming off, the pawn marches through. So what's the big deal about losing this game? Well, Magnus has now lost 2 games in a row of classical chess, so he hasn't done that since 2015, 8 years ago. An incredible stat in and of itself, but an even crazier start now to 2023 for Magnus Carlsen. If you want to see that incredible game against Anish Giri, then check out this video on screen, and do hit that subscribe button if you never want to miss one of these future videos. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.